Hello and welcome back to the second of the videos looking at the strategy as choice perspective. Remember, this is one of those four views of where competitive advantage comes from. In this case, competitive advantage being driven by the activities of the firm, so what it does, not what resources it has, and the idea that the complex system of activities makes it very hard for other firms to copy what you're doing. So advantage is sustainable. As we saw in the last video, this perspective is dominated by the work of Michael Porter. So understand the external environment and then make a choice of what position to occupy and then align the organisation to that position. Now back in 1980, Michael Porter really talked about those choices in terms of whether you choose to be differentiated, that is, you're providing different things to the market that customers value, that meets their needs more closely, and so they're willing to pay more for it, or you're choosing to be a cost leader. So you are inherently more efficient than your competitors, and therefore you can still make a profit at a lower price. Porter said if you don't make the choice, you will end up being stuck in the middle. Now that was where Porter was in the 1980s, and his thinking became mainstream during that time. But as the 1980s turned into the 1990s, other researchers suggested that there were positions where you could be both. You could be both differentiated and low cost. You could be the best cost producer. Others saying that this idea of positioning was only for a few privileged organisations who had the chance to choose. For most others, efficiency was actually where they could gain short-term advantage. There was also a disappointment in terms of the performance of US industry as a whole. Organisations were encouraged, therefore, to look at focusing on their core competences, which we'll hear about in a later video, or to focus on adopting best practice. Responding to the challenges, Porter came back with his own criticisms of the way in which strategy was being done in firms. I'm saying in many companies, leadership has degenerated into orchestrating operational improvements and making deals. So from Porter's perspective, what was happening in organisations wasn't strategy. He accepted that operational effectiveness is important. If you're not operationally effective, you're not keeping up with the effectiveness of your peers, then strategy doesn't matter. But operational effectiveness on its own is not enough, and it is certainly not strategy in Michael Porter's opinion. And so Michael Porter in 1996 re-engages with this topic of competitive advantage with a classic paper called What is Strategy? And that paper, together with a set of developments in his thinking that are portrayed in various videos over the 2000s and 2010s, we can see as constituting an upgraded view, or a Porter Mark II, if you like. Now Porter is still emphasising this importance of choice, and he is still focusing onto the primacy of activities as the building block of strategy. So he's saying competitive strategy is about being different. It means deliberately choosing to perform activities differently, or to perform different activities than rivals, to deliver a unique mix of value. Now to that he has added a set of factors that create a successful strategy. He says that all successful strategies will have a unique value proposition, a position in the market that is different from its competitors. Also, to deliver that value proposition, it will have a different tailored value chain. And within either that value proposition or in the activity choice being made, there are trade-offs, i.e. by choosing to do one thing, you're choosing not to do something else. Then the activities are not just standing alone. You're looking at a complete system of activities that work together and reinforce each other. And then finally he's saying that good strategies have continuity. You're not constantly switching and changing what the strategy is. That is needed to allow these activity choices to be aligned with what the value proposition is. So let's just look at each of those in turn. Firstly, a unique value proposition. Well, this is the maturing of Porter's idea about positioning. Remember, back in the 1980s, Porter made this distinction between differentiation and cost leadership. About the same time, he looked at a second dimension of this in terms of the scope of the firm. Coming forward into the 2010s, Porter has moved on to a more nuanced view, that of this value proposition. So rather than there being these discrete generic strategies, what he's now saying is that firms need to make decisions across three dimensions. First dimension is which customers is the firm going to serve, and importantly, which customers is it not going to serve. As Porter says, you cannot try to please everyone. Then the second dimension, where a choice is needed, of those customers, which needs are you going to satisfy? What needs are you going to meet? And again, in that you're choosing also what needs you're not going to serve. And then finally, what relative price position are you going to adopt? And for Porter, uniqueness comes from the combination of the answers you make about those three questions. Where are you on each of those dimensions? So you see here, we've left behind defined generic strategies. Instead, we're going to something more nuanced to the complexity of today's markets. But it's all very well making choices across those three dimensions. It's simple for another firm just to decide to do the same thing. So Porter says that that is not enough to deliver competitive advantage. And he talks about a number of lines of defence. If you look at this picture of a hill fort, you see how there's those different lines of defence to hold up and hopefully beat off attackers. In a similar way, Porter talks about there being lines of defence against imitation. Firstly, having to have a tailored value chain. Which one of these value chains fits? Well, clearly, they're all the same. So they all fit to deliver that need that market has. Which of these fits? They're all different, but only one of them fits. So what Porter is saying is that if you do not need a tailored value chain that's different in some way, if you do not need it to be different, anyone is going to be able to satisfy that need, and therefore you are not going to have competitive advantage. So you need to have a tailored value chain to have any chance of having sustainable competitive advantage. Let's look at this using an example of the car hire industry. So if you look at Hertz. Now Hertz is very much set up to service particularly affluent travellers, giving a quality service with quality pricing to match. It's happy to serve other customers, but that primarily is where its target has historically been. And to deliver to that value proposition, it has set its business up. So when at Heathrow, for example, you go into the Hertz office to rent your car, Well, it's a very pleasant environment. Nice colour scheme, lots of space, plants, places to sit. It has nicely laid out counters behind which uniformed staff sit. It has a special line for Gold Card members. In terms of the car it offers, they're often at the high end of the market. And it arranges partnerships with airline companies and with hotels that will also appeal to its target customer group. Now that value proposition and aligned value chain is very different if you looked at enterprise. Enterprise historically set up to service local budget customers. So people not necessarily travellers, but people who had a temporary need of a vehicle. Perhaps it's a school holiday and you need a slightly bigger car to take your kids to the beach. And if you look at the way its value chain is tailored, you'll find enterprises' offices typically in out-of-town trading estates or lower rent locations. The offices themselves are quite sparse, with a single counter, with very little furniture, very utilitarian. If you look at the cars that you rent, they're lower spec, more standard models. And if you look at it advertising, that is much more low budget, aiming to convey the message that this is low cost and affordable. We can look at another strategic position in this same area, that adopted by Zipcar. So here the target customers are what you could call city zipsters, people who are not looking to have a car. It's an ownership replacement, with pricing being high but for very short periods of time. And if you look at their value chain and the way that is tailored to deliver that value proposition, you see there's a lot of telematics technology being used. You open the car using a fob or an app on a phone. The cars are city runabouts that are suited for the environment in which they're being used. So three very different value propositions needing three tailored value chains. Now, each company, I'm sure, does not mind if others customers wish to come and use their services, but their focus is on those targeted customers and making the value chain fit the needs of those targeted customers. So, a tailored value chain as the first line of defence. Now the second line of defence is trade-off choices. So trade-off choice means that when you're committing to do one thing, it also means that you're turning your back on something else. Even if that alternative might be attractive, you are choosing where to focus rather than hedging your bets. Now Porter suggests that those trade-off choices can be both made in the value proposition, perhaps in the customers you're trying to serve, or the needs, or the price position you're adopting, or it can be in those activity choices that make up the tailored value chain. The issue here is that for a competitor to imitate what you're doing, they would have to make the same trade-off choice. And that may mean turning their back on some of their existing customers. Now, there are many examples where firms have tried to straddle two value propositions to not make that trade-off choice. We can see it playing out in the car rental market. Now, with Enterprise growing rapidly and becoming the largest car rental company in the US, Hertz felt they had to respond. And so they made the move into what's called off-airport rental. So looking to imitate Enterprise with its local services in the city centre and in suburban areas. And so Hertz set up thousands of 24/7 off-airport locations for its offices. And this is where it started to straddle those trade-off choices. So unlike Enterprise, Hertz would offer the full range of vehicles and features to those customers renting through those off-airport locations. Not something Enterprise would do. But for Hertz, that's a sensible decision. Our customers expect to have that range and choice. Also, in terms of the pricing structure, well, of course, Hertz was going to offer the same pricing structure as it did to its existing customer base. Of course, if one of its Gold Card members came to an off-airport location, it would expect that same approach to be made. In the shops, unlike that utilitarian approach that Enterprise was taking, Hertz would offer that same environment and would have a separate Gold Card counter to service those very best customers. Pick up and drop off service. Well, that is something that Hertz would offer to its customers. So of course it's going to offer that from its new locations. All these points where Enterprise had made a trade-off choice, Hertz was trying to straddle two value propositions to blur those choices it needed in its value chain to take cost out and so rival Enterprise. And of course, as a result, Hertz was less efficient in that off-airport market, and that was a contributory factor to its performance dipping in the years that followed. There are other examples you could give in terms of the low-cost airline market, with US carriers responding to Southwest Airlines, Continental Light, going bankrupt as a result. Now, trade-off choices, a tailored value chain is still not enough to stop your competitors imitating you. You could, instead of trying to straddle from your existing location, you could set up a separate business that trades in those different parts of the market. And we see this in terms of what's happened in the car rental market subsequently. Avis has acquired Zipcar. Hertz itself acquired Thrifty. So looking to target different parts of the market through different business models. We also see this in the US airline market. United owning low-cost carriers like Express Jet, Delta with Endeavour, and American with Envoy and Piedmont. So trade-off choices and a tailored value chain is not enough to stop imitation. And this will move to Porter's third line of defence. It's all very well for a competitor to have to copy one activity, maybe the value chain and one part of the value chain. But if all activities that you are performing in your business are aligned, then if you're a competitor looking to mimic that value proposition, you need to cover all their activities. Now, whilst one activity might be very easy to copy, maybe 75% chance. If you have to copy 10, that's 75% times 75%, 10 times. If it's 100, you're starting to get to a very, very small percentage chance of succeeding to copy the whole thing. So for Porter, sustainable competitive advantage comes when you also have that fit across the whole system of activities. Now, Porter introduces the notion of orders of fit to reflect the extent to which that system is aligned. The first order fit he talks about as being simple consistency. So this is when all the activity choices made in the business directly align with that choice of value proposition. Second order fit he calls reinforcing fit. And this is where not only do those activity choice align with the value proposition, but they reinforce each other. So you get synergy between those choices of activities. So the sum of the parts is more than just 1 + 1. There is a higher order fit, which Porter calls optimization of effort. And this is where not only do you have that consistency and that reinforcing, the firm is constantly optimizing the fit. It's dialing some parts up but equally it's dialing other parts down so that as a whole the system is optimized. A good example of this is with motor racing. In a racing car, all parts are designed so that car will go as fast as possible. So you get simple consistency between the design of the parts and the purpose of the car. But more than that, the different parts work together. The aileron and the tyres inform better traction going around the corners, so you get reinforcing fit. But that's not enough to win the Grand Prix. When the car gets to the track, the engineers are fine-tuning that fit to that track to make it perfect for that race. Now, Porter offers the activity system map as a way to assess the order of fit, and we'll explore that in the next video. But once you've got to that point where you've got that high level of fit of your system of activities, you then have to stick with it. You can't keep swapping around in terms of what choices you're making. You can't keep changing your value proposition and your strategy. And that means resisting a number of siren calls. Often you'll hear, well, if we just offer this extra feature, we'll be able to bring in a few more customers. Or if we just move into this market, we'll be able to grow a bit more. We're under pressure from shareholders to increase our quarterly growth rate. Porter calls that the growth trap. The issue here is by doing those little extras, you dilute that order of fit, and so your effectiveness falls, making it more and more possible for competitors to copy what you're doing. So this then highlights the importance of leadership in strategy and a big onus on the leader to be able to say no. So competitive advantage, sustainable competitive advantage, is based on choosing a distinctive position defined by a unique value proposition, and in that deliberately choosing not to do things. So make it difficult for competitors to copy what you're doing. You need to have trade-off choices and then fully align the whole system activities in the business to that value proposition, such that it is the complexity of that system that makes it incredibly difficult for others to do what you do. But beware, maintaining it can be hard. Now, there are some critiques of Porter's work. There is still the view that positioning can only be achieved by a few, otherwise it's a ploy. Also, a concern about environmental determinism, as the external environment is dictating where your advantage comes from. You need to have a very stable environment, and that just doesn't exist in today's market. Also, a criticism of the assumption that advantage comes from activities and not resources. For many theorists, unique resources can be a source of competitive advantage. However, this is a highly useful perspective to use as a tool to gain insight into businesses and their strategies. And we'll work through the example of IKEA to show how we might do this in the next video.